how did the other half live in 1800s New York? The short answer is horrifying. Massive population growth and industrialization meant living conditions at the end of the 19th century for the city's impoverished inhabitants were simply terrible. Jacob Riis, 1849 to 1914, was a Danish-American social reformer and photographer who, working as a police reporter, made a significant contribution to the reform of the city's appalling sanitary conditions by documenting and exposing the squalid accommodation in its tenements and the laissez-faire attitude of slum landlords. He was well placed to reveal such poverty, since when he arrived in America in 1870, he had exhausted his money, experiencing hunger and homelessness for himself. As a reporter, he revealed and photographed dark streets of overcrowded tenements, stale beer, dives, crime and poverty in the city's Lower East Side. Today, you will hear him describe the repulsive living conditions of some of the rundown, cramped and fetid alleys in the 4th Ward of Lower Manhattan, a working-class district which, in the late 1800s, turned out more criminals than all the rest of the city together. You will discover some incredible characters that lived in the horribly crowded and dirty tenements found in these alleys, including the story of the bizarre-sounding Swamp Angels. This is the story of the people condemned to live a brutal life in New York's back alleys. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. Leaving the elevated railroad where it dives under the Brooklyn Bridge at Franklin Square, scarce a dozen steps will take us where we wish to go. With its rush and roar echoing yet in our ears, we have turned the corner from prosperity to poverty. We stand upon the domain of the tenement. In the shadow of the great stone abutments, the old Knickerbocker houses linger like ghosts of a departed day. Down the winding slope of Cherry Street, proud and fashionable Cherry Hill that was, their broad steps, sloping roofs, and dormer windows are easily made out, all the more easily for the contrast with the ugly barracks that elbow them right and left. These never had other design than to shelter, at as little outlay as possible, the greatest crowds out of which rent could be wrung. They were the bad afterthought of a heedless day. The years have brought to the old houses unhonoured age, a querulous second childhood that is out of tune with the time. Their tenants, the neighbours, and cries out against them and against you in fretful protest in every step on their rotten floors or squeaky stairs. Good cause may they have for their fretting. This one with its shabby front and poorly patched roof. What glowing firesides, what happy children may it once have owned. Heavy feet, too often with unsteady step, for the pothouses next door, where is it not next door in these slums, have worn away the brown stone steps since. The broken columns at the door have rotted away at the base. Of the handsome cornice, barely a trace is left. Dirt and desolation reign in the wide hallway, and danger lurks on the stairs. Rough pine boards fence off the roomy fireplaces, where coal is bought by the pail at the rate of $12 a ton. These have no place. The arched gateway leads no longer to a shady bower on the banks of the rushing stream, inviting to daydreams with its gentle repose, but to a dark and nameless alley, shut in by high brick walls, cheerless as the lives of those they shelter. The wolf knocks loudly at the gate in the troubled dreams that come to this alley, echoes of the day's cares. A horde of dirty children play about the dripping hydrant, the only thing in the alley that thinks enough of its chance to make the most of it. It is the best it can do. These are the children of the tenements, the growing generation of the slums. This their home, from the great highway overhead, along which throbs the life tide of two great cities. One might drop a pebble into half a dozen such alleys. One yawns just across the street, not very broadly, but it is not to blame. The builder of the old gateway had no thought of its ever becoming a public thoroughfare. Once inside it widens, but only to make room for a big box-like building with the worn and greasy look of the slum tenement that is stamped alike on the houses and their tenants down here, even on the homeless dog that romps with the children in yonder building lot, with an air of expectant interest plainly betraying the forlorn hope that at some stage of the game a meat bone may show up in the role of it. Vain hope, truly. Nothing more appetizing than a bare-legged ragamuffin appears. Meat bones not long since picked clean are as scarce in Blind Man's Alley as elbow room in any Fourth Ward backyard. The shouts of the children come hushed over the housetops, as if apologizing for the intrusion. Few glad noises make this old alley ring. Morning and evening it echoes with the gentle, groping tap of the blind man's staff as he feels his way to the street. Blind Man's Alley bears its name for a reason. Until little more than a year ago, its dark burrows harboured a colony of blind beggars, tenants of a blind landlord, old Daniel Murphy, whom every child in the ward knows if he never heard of the President of the United States. Old Dan made a big fortune, he told me once, $400,000, out of his alley and the surrounding tenements, only to grow blind himself in extreme old age, sharing in the end the chief hardship of the wretched beings whose lot he had stubbornly refused to better that he might increase his wealth, even when the Board of Health at last compelled him to repair and clean up the worst of the old buildings, under threat of driving out the tenants and locking the doors behind them. The work was accomplished against the old man's angry protests. He appeared in person before the board to argue his case, and his argument was characteristic. "I have made my will," he said. "My monument stands waiting for me in Calvary. I stand on the very brink of the grave, blind and helpless, and now—" Here the pathos of the appeal was swept under in a burst of angry indignation. "Do you want me to build and get skinned? Skinned? These people are not fit to live in a nice house. Let them go where they can, and let my house stand." In spite of the genuine anguish of the appeal, it was downright amusing to find that his anger was provoked less by the anticipated waste of luxury on his tenants than by his distrust of his own kind, the builder. He knew intuitively what to expect. The result showed that Mr. Murphy had gauged his tenants correctly. The cleaning-up process apparently destroyed the home feeling of the alley. Many of the blind people moved away and did not return. Some remained, however, and the name has clung to the place. Some idea of what is meant by a sanitary cleaning up in these slums may be gained from the account of a mishap I met with once in taking a flashlight picture of a group of blind beggars in one of the tenements down here. With unpractised hands, I managed to set fire to the house. When the blinding effect of the flash had passed away and I could see once more, I discovered that a lot of paper and rags that hung on the wall were ablaze. There were 6 of us, 5 blind men and women who knew nothing of their danger, and myself in an attic room with a dozen crooked, rickety stairs between us and the street, and as many households as helpless as the one whose guest I was all about us. The thought, how were they ever to be got out, made my blood run cold as I saw the flames creeping up the wall, and my first impulse was to bolt for the street and shout for help. The next was to smother the fire myself, and I did, with a vast deal of trouble. Afterward, when I came down to the street, I told a friendly policeman of my trouble. For some reason, he thought it rather a good joke, and laughed immoderately at my concern, lest even then sparks should be burrowing in the rotten wall that might yet break out in flame and destroy the house with all that were in it. He told me why, when he found time to draw breath. "Why, don't you know," he said, "that house is the Dirty Spoon. It caught fire 6 times last winter, but it wouldn't burn. The dirt was so thick on the walls, it smothered the fire." which, if true, shows that water and dirt, not usually held to be harmonious elements, work together for the good of those who insure houses. Sunless and joyless though it be, Blind Man's Alley has that which it compeers of the slums vainly yearn for. It has a payday. Once a year, sunlight shines into the lives of its forlorn crew, past and present. In June, when the superintendent of out-of-door poor distributes the $20,000 annually allowed the poor blind by the city in half-hearted recognition of its failure to otherwise provide for them, Blind Man's Alley takes a day off and goes to see Mr. Blake. That night it is noisy with unwonted merriment. There is scraping of squeaky fiddles in the dark rooms, and cracked old voices sing long-forgotten songs. Even the blind landlord rejoices, for much of the money goes into his coffers. From their perch, up among the rafters, Mrs. Gallagher's blind boarders might hear, did they listen, the tramp of the policeman always on duty in Gotham Court. Half a stone's throw away. His beat, though it takes in but a small portion of a single block, is quite as lively as most larger patrol rounds. A double row of 5-story tenements, back to back under a common roof, extending back from the street 234 feet, with barred openings in the dividing wall, so that the tenants may see but cannot get at each other from the stairs, makes the court. Alleys one wider by a couple of feet than the other, whence the distinction single and double alley, skirt the barracks on either side. Such, briefly, is the tenement that has challenged public attention more than any in the whole city and tested the power of sanitary law and rule for 40 years. The name of the pile is not down in the city directory, but in the public records it holds an unenviable place. It was here the mortality rose during the last great cholera epidemic to the unprecedented rate of 195 in 1,000 inhabitants. In its worst days, a full 1,000 could not be packed into the court, though the number did probably not fall far short of it. Even now, under the management of men of conscience and an agent, a king's daughter whose practical energy, kindliness and good sense have done much to redeem its foul reputation, the swarms it shelters would make more than one fair-sized country village. The mixed character of the population, by this time about equally divided between the Celtic and the Italian stock, accounts for the iron bars and the policeman. It was an eminently Irish suggestion that the latter was to be credited to the presence of 2 German families in the court, who made trouble all the time. A Chinese man whom I questioned, as he hurried past the iron gate of the alley, put the matter in a different light. "Them is very bad," he said. Gotham Court has been the entering wedge for the Italian element, who until recently had not attained a foothold in the 4th Ward, but are now trailing across Chatham Street from their stronghold in the Bend, in ever-increasing numbers, seeking, according to their wont, the lowest level. It is curious to find that this notorious block, whose name was so long synonymous with all that was desperately bad, was originally built, in 1851, by a benevolent Quaker, for the express purpose of rescuing the poor people from the dreadful rookeries they were then living in. How long it continued a model tenement is not on record. It could not have been very long, for already in 1862, 10 years after it was finished, a sanitary official counted 146 cases of sickness in the court, including all kinds of infectious disease, from smallpox down, and reported that of 138 children born in it in less than 3 years, 61 had died, mostly before they were 1 year old. Several years later, the inspector of the district reported to the Board of Health that nearly 10% of the population is sent to the public hospitals each year. When the alley was finally taken in hand by the authorities, and as a first step towards its reclamation, the entire population was driven out by the police. Experience dictated, as one of the first improvements to be made, the putting in of a kind of sewer grating so constructed, as the official report patiently puts it, as to prevent the ingress of persons disposed to make a hiding place. Of the sewer and the cellars into which they opened, the fact was that the big vaulted sewers had long been a runway for thieves, the swamp angels, who through them easily escaped when chased by the police, as well as a storehouse for their plunder. The sewers are there today. In fact, the two alleys are nothing but the roofs of these enormous tunnels in which a man may walk upright the full distance of the block and into the Cherry Street sewer, if he likes the fun, and is not afraid of rats. Could their grimy walls speak, the big canals might tell many a startling tale, but they are silent enough, and so are most of those whose secrets they might betray. The floodgates connecting with the Cherry Street main are closed now, except when the water is drained off. Then there were no gates, and it is on record that the sewers were chosen as a shortcut habitually by residents of the court, whose business lay on the line of them, near a manhole, perhaps, in Cherry Street or at the river mouth of the big pipe when it was clear at low tide. "Meet Jimmy," said one wrinkled old dame who looked in while we were nosing about under Double Alley. "He used to go to his work along down Cherry Street that way every morning and come back at night." The associations must have been congenial. Probably Jimmy himself fitted into the landscape. Halfway back from the street in this latter alley is a tenement facing the main building on the west side of the way. That was not originally part of the court proper. It stands there, a curious monument to a Quaker's revenge, a living illustration of the power of hate to perpetuate its bitter fruit beyond the grave. The lot upon which it was built was the property of John Wood, brother of Silas, the builder of Gotham Court. He sold the Cherry Street front to a man who built upon it a tenement, with entrance only from the street. Mr. Wood afterward quarrelled about the partition line with his neighbour, Alderman Mullins, who had put up a long tenement barrack on his lot after the style of the court, and the alderman knocked him down. Tradition records that the Quaker picked himself up with the quiet remark, "I will pay thee for that, friend alderman," and went his way. His manner of paying was to put up the big building in the rear of 34 Cherry Street, with an immense blank wall right in front of the windows of Alderman Mullen's tenements, shutting out effectually light and air from them. But as he had no access to the street from his building for many years, it could not be let or used for anything, and remained vacant until it passed under the management of the Gotham Court property. Mullen's Court is there yet, and so is the Quaker's vengeful wall that has cursed the lives of thousands of innocent people since. At its farther end, the alley between the two that begins inside the Cherry Street tenement, 6 or 7 feet wide, narrows down to less than 2 feet. It is barely possible to squeeze through, but few care to do it, for the rift leads to the jail of the Oak Street police station, and therefore is not popular with the growing youth of the district. There is crape on the door of the alderman's court as we pass out, and upstairs in one of the tenements preparations are making for a wake. A man lies dead in the hospital, who was cut to pieces in a can racket in the alley on Sunday. The sway of the excise law is not extended to these back alleys. It would matter little if it were. There are secret byways, and some it is not held worthwhile to keep secret, along which the growler wanders at all hours and all seasons, unmolested. It climbed the stairs so long and so often that day that murder resulted. It is nothing unusual on Cherry Street, nothing to make a fuss about. Not a week before, 2 or 3 blocks up the street, The police felt called upon to interfere in one of these can rackets at 2 o'clock in the morning to secure peace for the neighbourhood. The interference took the form of a general fusillade, during which one of the disturbers fell off the roof and was killed. There was the usual wake, and nothing more was heard of it. What, indeed, was there to say? The Rock of Aegis is the name over the door of a low saloon that blocks the entrance to another alley, if possible more forlorn and dreary than the rest, as we pass out the alderman's court. It sounds like a jeer from the days, happily past, when the wickedest man in New York lived round the corner a little way and boasted of his title. One cannot take many steps in Cherry Street without encountering some relic of past or present prominence in the ways of crime. Scarce one that does not turn up specimen bricks of the coming thief. The Cherry Street tough is all-pervading. Ask Superintendent Murray, who, as captain of the Oak Street squad, in 7 months secured convictions for theft, robbery, and murder, aggregating no less than 530 years of penal servitude. And he will tell you of his opinion that the Fourth Ward, even in the last 20 years, has turned out more criminals than all the rest of the city together. But though the Swamp Angels have gone to their reward, their successors carry on business at the old stand as successfully, if not as boldly. There goes one who was once a shining light in thiefdom. He has reformed since, they say. The policeman on the corner, who is addicted to a professional unbelief in reform of any kind, will tell you that while on the island once he sailed away on a shutter, paddling along until he was picked up in Hell Gate by a schooner's crew, whom he persuaded that he was a fanatic, performing some sort of religious penance by his singular expedition. Over yonder, Tweed the arch-thief worked in a brush shop and earned an honest living before he took to politics. As we stroll from one narrow street to another, the odd contrast between the old-looking houses in the front and the towering tenements in the backyards grows even more striking. Perhaps because we expect, and are looking for it. Nobody who was not would suspect the presence of the rear houses, though they have been there long enough. Here is one 7 stories high, behind one with only 3 floors. Take a look into this Roosevelt Street alley, just about 1 step wide, with a 5-story house on one side that gets light and air. God help us for pitiful mockery from this slit between brick walls. There are no windows in the wall on the other side. It is perfectly blank. The fire escapes of the long tenement fairly touch it, but the rays of the sun, rising, setting, or at high noon, never do. It never shone into the alley from the day the devil planned and man built it. There was once an English doctor who experimented with the sunlight in the soldiers' barracks, and found that on the side that was shut off altogether from the sun, the mortality was 100% greater than on the light side, where its rays had free access. But then soldiers are of some account, have a fixed value, if not a very high one. The people who live here have not. The horse that pulls the dirt cart one of these labourers loads and unloads is ever so much more account to the employer of his labour than he and all that belongs to him. Ask the owner. He will not attempt to deny it, if the horse is worth anything. The man too knows it. It is the one thought that occasionally troubles the owner of the horse in the enjoyment of his prosperity, built of and upon the successful assertion of the truth that all men are created equal. With what a shock did the story of yonder Madison Street alley come home to New Yorkers one morning, 8 or 10 years ago, when a fire that broke out after the men had gone to their work swept up those narrow stairs and burned up women and children to the number of a full 50. There were fire escapes, yes, but so placed that they could not be reached. The firemen had to look twice before they could find the opening that passes for a thoroughfare. A stout man would never venture in. Some wonderfully heroic rescues were made at that fire by people living in the adjoining tenements. Danger and trouble of the imminent kind, not the everyday sort that excites neither interest nor commiseration. Run even this common clay into heroic moulds on occasions that help us to remember that the gap that separates the man with the patched coat from his wealthy neighbour is, after all, perhaps but a tenement. Yet what a gap! And of whose making? Here, as we stroll along Madison Street, workmen are busy putting the finishing touches to the brownstone front of a tall new tenement. This one will probably be called an apartment house. They are carving satyrs' heads in the stone, with a crowd of gaping youngsters looking on in admiring wonder. Next door are two other tenements, likewise with brownstone fronts, fair to look at. The youngest of the children in the group is not too young to remember how their army of tenants was turned out by the health officers because the houses had been condemned as unfit for human beings to live in. The owner was a wealthy builder who stood high in the community. Is it only in our fancy that the sardonic leer on the stone faces seem to list that way? Or is it an introspective grin? We will not ask if the new house belongs to the same builder. He too may have been reformed. We have crossed the boundary of the 7th Ward, Penitentiary Row, suggestive name for a block of Cherry Street tenements, is behind us. Within recent days it has become peopled wholly with Hebrews, the overflow from Jewtown adjoining, peddlers and tailors, all of them. It is odd to read this legend from other days over the door. No peddlers allowed in this house. These thrifty people are not only crowding into the tenements of this once exclusive district, they are buying them. The Jew runs to real estate as soon as he can save up enough for a deposit to clinch the bargain. Here comes a pleasure party, as gay as any on the avenue, though the carryall is an ash cart. The father is the driver, and he has taken his brown-legged boy for a ride. How proud and happy they both look up there on their perch. The queer old building they have halted in front of is the Ship, famous for 50 years as a ramshackle tenement filled with the oddest crowd. No one knows why it is called the Ship, though there is a tradition that once the river came clear up here to Hamilton Street, and boats were moored alongside it. More likely it is because it is as bewildering inside as a crazy old ship, with its ups and downs of ladders, parading as stairs, and its unexpected pitfalls. But Hamilton Street, like Water Street, is not what it was. The missions drove from the latter the worst of its dives. A sailor's mission has lately made its appearance in Hamilton Street, but there are no dives there, nothing worse than the ubiquitous saloon and tough tenements. Enough of them everywhere. Suppose we look into one. No? Cherry Street. Be a little careful, please. Please. The hall is dark, and you might stumble over the children pitching pennies back there. Not that it would hurt them. Kicks and cuffs are their daily diet. They have little else. Here, where the hall turns and dives into utter darkness, is a step, and another, and another. A flight of stairs. You can feel your way if you cannot see it. Close? Yes. What would you have? All the fresh air that ever enters these stairs comes from the hall door that is forever slamming, and from the windows of dark bedrooms that in turn receive from the stairs their sole supply of the elements God meant to be free. But man deals out with such bad hand. That was a woman filling her pail by the hydrant you just bumped against. The sinks are in the hallway, that all the tenants may have access, and all be poisoned alike by their summer stenches. Hear the pump squeak. It is the lullaby of tenement house babes. In summer, when 1,000 thirsty throats pant for a cooling drink in this block, it is worked in vain. But the saloon, whose open door you passed in the hall, is always there. The smell of it has followed you up. Here is a door. Listen. That short, hacking cough, that tiny, helpless wail. What do they mean? What do they mean? They mean that the soiled bow of white you saw on the door downstairs will have another story to tell. Oh, a sadly familiar story, before the day is at an end. The child is dying with measles. With half a chance it might have lived. But it had none. That dark bedroom killed it. It was took all of a sudden, says the mother, smoothing the throbbing little body with trembling hands. There is no unkindness in the rough voice of the man in the jumper, who sits by the window grimly smoking a clay pipe, with a little life ebbing out in his sight, bitter as his words sound. Hush, Mary, if we cannot keep the baby, need we complain, such as we? Such as we. What if the words ring in your ears as we grope our way up the stairs and down from floor to floor, listening to the sounds behind the closed doors, some of quarrelling, some of coarse songs, more of profanity? They are true. When the summer heats come with their suffering, they have meaning more terrible than words can tell. Come over here. Step carefully over this baby. It is a baby, spite of its rags and dirt, under these iron bridges called fire escapes, but loaded down despite the incessant watchfulness of the firemen with broken household goods, with wash-tubs and barrels over which no man could climb from a fire. This gap between dingy brick walls is the yard. That strip of rose-coloured sky up there is the heaven of these people. Do you wonder the name does not attract them to the churches? That baby's parents live in the rear tenement here. She is at least as clean as the steps we are now climbing. There are plenty of houses with 100 such in. The tenement is much more like the one in front we just left, only fouler, closer, darker. We will not say more cheerless. The word is a mockery. 100,000 people lived in rear tenements in New York last year. Here is a room neater than the rest. The woman, a stout matron with hard lines of care in her face, is at the wash tub. I try to keep the children clean, she says apologetically, but with a hopeless glance around. The spice of hot soap suds is added to the air already tainted with the smell of boiling cabbage, of rags and uncleanliness all around. It makes an overpowering compound. It is Thursday, but patched linen is hung upon the pulley line from the window. There is no Monday cleaning in the tenements. It is wash day all week round, for a change of clothing is scarce among the poor. They are poverty's honest badge, these perennial lines of rags hung out to dry, those that are not the washerwoman's professional shingle. The true line to be drawn between pauperism and honest poverty is the clothesline. With it begins the effort to be clean. That is the first and the best evidence of a desire to be honest. What sort of an answer, think you, would come from these tenements to the question, is life worth living? Were they heard at all in the discussion? It may be that this, cut from the last report, but one of the Association for the Improvement of the Condition of the Poor, a long name for a weary task, has a suggestion of it. In the depth of winter, the attention of the association was called to a Protestant family living in a garret in a miserable tenement in Cherry Street. The family's condition was most deplorable. The man, his wife, and 3 small children shivering in one room, through the roof of which the pitiless winds of winter whistled. The room was almost barren of furniture. The parents slept on the floor, the elder children in boxes, and the baby was swung in an old shawl attached to the rafters by cords by way of a hammock. The father, a seaman, had been obliged to give up that calling because he was in consumption, and was unable to provide either bread or fire for his little ones. Perhaps this may be put down as an exceptional case, but one that came to my notice some months ago in a 7th Ward tenement was typical enough to escape that reproach. There were 9 in the family, husband, wife, an aged grandmother, and 6 children, honest, hard-working Germans, scrupulously neat, but poor. All 9 lived in 2 rooms, one about 10 feet square that served as a parlour, bedroom and eating room, the other a small hall room made into a kitchen. The rent was $7.50 a month, more than a week's wages for the husband and father, who was the only breadwinner in the family. That day the mother had thrown herself out of the window and was carried up from the street dead. She was Discouraged, said some of the other women from the tenement, who had come in to look after the children while a messenger carried the news to the father at the shop. They went stolidly about their task, although they were evidently not without feeling for the dead woman. No doubt she was wrong in not taking life philosophically, as did the 4 families a city missionary found housekeeping in the 4 corners of one room. They got along well enough together until one of the families took a boarder and made trouble. Philosophy, according to my optimistic friend, naturally inhabits the tenements. The people who live there come to look upon death in a different way from the rest of us. Do not take it as hard. He has never found time to explain how the fact fits into his general theory that life is not unbearable in the tenements. Unhappily for the philosophy of the slums, it is too apt to be of the kind that readily recognizes the saloon, always handy as the refuge from every trouble, and shapes its practice according to the discovery.